you for joining us today for our Equal Pay Educational Briefing, the Hidden Accelerators of the Gender Pay Gap. We thank you for committing to equal pay and equity in your workplace. My name is Kimberlee Vaye, and I'm the Program Director with the California Commission on the Status of Women and Girls. A few reminders: this session is being recorded and will be available on the Commission's website within 1 week, and we towards the end, or you can place a question in the chat during the discussion. Please remain on mute unless you would like to ask a question towards the end of our conversation. All right, I need to introduce our speaker today. Nishiura Mackenzie is a speaker, researcher, and change agent in creating inclusive organizations. She is co-founder of the Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab, which conducts impact research. She collaborated with the California Partners Project, a nonprofit co-founded by California First partner Jennifer Siebel-Newsome, to create a board culture playbook and a board recruiting playbook. Lori was recognized as a 2022 LinkedIn Top Voice in Gender Equity, a BBC's 100 Women in 2017, and in the award-winning documentary Bias, which premiered in 2018. Her work has been published in the Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, Inc., Fast Company, and Inc. And in 2020, Lori was awarded the CEDA Human Rights Award, Education, from the San Francisco Department on the Status of Women. Lori brings 20 years of marketing strategy and business management experience at companies including Procter & Gamble, Apple, eBay, and PayPal. She is a board member of the Center for Institutional Courage and an advisor to August Public and Optionality. Lori has an MBA from the Wharton School of Business and a BA in Economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Lori.
Thank you for inviting me, Kimberlee, and thank you everyone who's spending the time to learn about ways we can reduce the pay gap.
You're very welcome. Mission. I want to start out with the mission of the Stanford VM Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. That's a very, I thought the commission's name was long. That's a long name too. It's a great name. But the mission is to generate foundational research to advance women's leadership by diagnosing barriers, developing and evaluating interventions to get beyond those barriers, and disseminating research-based solutions by bridging the gap between research and practice. So my question for you as co-founder of the lab, what motivated you and inspired you to create it? And we would love to hear if you could just share an overview of the lab and your team, your awesome team, and the research that you conduct.
Thank you so much, Kimberlee. And I guess I'll go back to why I started looking into gender equity in the first place, which is really the motivator for why I'm involved with the lab. I remember when I was pregnant with my second child, my daughter, and I would just cry and cry. And my friend said, "Why are you crying?" And I said, "Well, look at the state of girls. You know, there's so much suffering, and I'm going to raise this girl into this world. And it's really troublesome to think that I will do my best to protect my girl, but she's a sister to everyone. What can we do?" And I'm crying, thinking my friend was going to give me, a nice little sympathetic pat. And she just looked at me and said, "Lori, you can cry or you can do something about it." And that is really the motivation for me, why I'm involved with the lab and wanted it to be founded, is I discovered in my work that we don't always know exactly why we're not achieving gender equity. And places like Stanford University really have the resources to investigate that and create pathways for change. And the lab is absolutely committed to that. So we do what is called impact research. It's foundational in that we're trying to understand why dynamics persist over time, but it has impact because we do our research in communities, we do it in organizations with leaders, and our approach is really to try to figure out the barriers and then to come up with interventions. And it's that intervention work that isn't always as well studied. It's very hard to do. Some of our projects take years to undertake and years to write about, and not everyone has the capacity to do that work. So,
For the
No, what are you apologizing for? Not a problem.
because it's not it's that is
so our work is trying to bring insights to an area that hasn't really been well studied. And that was the motivation. We want to help be part of a future of greater gender equity by providing research-based insights.
That's awesome. Thank you. And a few things that stood out in my mind that you said was, that when you were pregnant with your second child who happened to be a girl, it is sometimes it's those moments in your life where you're like, oh my goodness, this is going to affect like me so much personally, right? And but I think your friend, although that wasn't the response you were looking for, was probably right on, right? Like, and I mean, I think you took that and achieved much more with her advice. And also, I love that you said, getting the resources and pathways for change, because pathway is such, I love that word. I think too often we hear in the gender equity work, like spaces, pipelines. And I'm like, pipelines are just, it's not pathways. There's different pathways, right? And I think, and when you said impact research takes time and working with doing the interventions in the communities, yeah, I mean, so much research. When I think about research, and I'm hearing people talk about what they do, I always think, is there a longitudinal study? Like, how long does this last? Is this sustainable, right? Like all of these things. And it's so great to hear that, you're doing the work and taking the time to actually really determine what are the barriers, what are the interventions that have long lasting impact on the communities. So that's great to hear. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So many of the folks on the call today are California Equal Pay Pledge signatories. Not all, but some of them are. And, but even if you're not a signatory, you are committed to equal pay in the workplace and committing to closing the gender gap. And so, but the pledge, by conducting the pledge, you commit to a few things. One is conduct an annual internal company-wide gender pay gap analysis, promote equal pay best practices such as increased pay transparency, training on retaliation protections, and training for supervisors and managers on pay equity laws. And California has some of the strongest pay equity and equal pay laws. And reviewing hiring and promotion processes and procedures to reduce the unconscious bias and, like you said, the barriers to equality. So having said that, it's a lot. I would like to kind of level set an understanding for everybody on the call today to make sure that we have a shared understanding of some of the terms that we'll be discussing during our conversation, and a few terms, bias. And so what is the definition of bias? And then also, why is it important to know and recognize stereotypes and the ideal of meritocracy?
Thank you so much, Kimberlee. And I love that the pledge is so broad. So as you know, when people at first glimpse think about pay, they think about salary only and trying to correct salary. But as you illuminated with that longer list, there's so many factors that lead to differences in outcomes that lead to the pay gap. And so by addressing those, we have a better chance of creating more equitable organizations. So the way Shelley Carell, who is our lab PI, our director, defines bias is that it's an error in assessment. And the reason why I like this definition that she uses is that your brain wants to, you as an individual want to evaluate people based on their contributions. And you want to see candidates for hire based on what they will bring to your organization. So if that's the case, why is it that we find we're not always picking the best candidate or giving the right person the advancement that they deserve. That's an error. It means our brains, in quickly categorizing people as competent or not competent, an asset or not an asset, our brains saw someone as better or worse than they actually are, not due to their actual performance, but the filter our brain has used to put people in those categories. Now, our brain's categorizing all the time. Like I use Zoom more than I use Teams, but when you explain to me how to do things, boom, my brain really could understand how to function in a different platform. That's the beauty of our brains categorizing, making sense, and then having us adapt to a new situation. Now, the challenges around people, that the factors that help our brains differentiate between people are stereotypes. And stereotypes are shared beliefs about categories of people that essentializes and minimizes them. And although your brain might find it useful for some context, like if I need to find a police officer, the person in the uniform is more likely to be a police officer than the person outside, although not always the case, it can make mistakes at work. And that's why it's an error. So for example, we know about stereotypes. Let's say for someone like myself, let's say a middle-aged Asian woman, right? The stereotype might be that I am modest and very supportive and probably smart and good at math and tasks. And the thing about stereotypes is they don't necessarily have anything to do with me. So while it kind of generally puts me into a category that I think people are like, oh, that makes sense. She's that kind of person. It might not have anything to do with me. So for example, when I went to business school, it wasn't difficult to find people who wanted to be in my statistics study group, right? Stereotype on math, but little did they know it's not my favorite subject, even though I took economics. So that stereotype would have them think I'm a excited and passionate study group partner, but in reality, I really didn't like to study statistics so much in business school, right? So stereotypes can fool us into thinking someone is leader-like or not leader-like instantly, but upon examination, we find out we're completely false. And the problem at work is that many of the stereotypes of things like leadership, genius, technical competence, financial planning, a lot of those stereotypes favor certain kinds of people. In general, like white men. And because of that, other people who are equally or more qualified, our brain's not instantly categorizing them into the right candidate. And they have to often prove themselves more that they are competent, right? So kind of the catch up despite the qualifications. And so that's the definition of bias that, as you can imagine, contributes to the pay gap, because it could mean someone who's equally qualified did not get the promotion and pay increase in our organization, or got a smaller pay increase despite qualifications. And over time, that could lead to quite extensive pay gaps for people.
Thank you. And how does meritocracy fit in all of that? When we think about, yeah.
That's a great question. I often call meritocracy a myth. So if you look up the definition of myth in the dictionary, it's a widely held but false belief. I like the term widely held because it implies we're holding on to it. We're the ones reinforcing the myth, but it's false. But because it's so widely held, we don't realize that the data doesn't support what's actually happening. So meritocracy is the belief that all ideas, all people are able to be evaluated purely based on their merit. And tons of social science research shows this error in assessing, where the exact same resume with a man's name or a woman's name gets very different rating. So that's an error. It means the exact same resume will get a higher or lower rating depending on the name on it. And that's been shown also for racialized names, right? So Southeast Asian names versus what sound like Western European names will get a lower rating. So our brain, and it's not Lori, am trying to assess people differently. It's like an optical illusion. I see a resume, it doesn't look qualified. I think I'm evaluating it based on its merit. I have concerns about it, about their capacity to truly perform. I put it into the doubt pile. And then I see a different resume with a different name. Oh, it looks like it has potential. I put it into the possibly interview pile. And that happens without us realizing that stereotypes have influenced how we've assessed the resume. And so meritocracy is a myth. It could be a goal, but it's a goal that we don't hold on to. It's a goal we have to continually strive towards by debiasing our processes and decision making. So the trick to meritocracy, the way to achieve it is by debiasing, not by assuming we've achieved it and making decisions based on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I love that. Meritocracy is a myth. It's a widely held but false belief. Yes. Okay. No, thanks for that clarification. And as you were talking about the resume, it is real. I mean, I've recently read that a lot of people change their names on their resumes just to get a chance. And then sometimes when they show up, they get the interview and they show up and the person's like, you don't look like the name, you put on the resume. It's like, well, I'm the person I put on the resume, the name doesn't really, I mean, it matters, of course, but, they still have done all of these wonderful things. And so that's a barrier from the gate, right? For even getting the position or a chance to interview for the position. All right. Okay. So your lab had something really great that I will share out with folks on this call. Some of them might already have seen it, but I'll share out with them after. But it's called C bias block bias, a methodology to diagnose bias. And so research shows that there are several ways that bias backlash, which is resistance to the idea that bias actually exists, stands in the way of organizations when creating programs and tools to block bias. So my question for you, I would love for you to just walk us through the steps of diagnosing bias and how these expand a little bit more on how these biases accelerate the gender pay gap.
Absolutely. And I love that first part of your question, Kimberlee, when you said that there are people who resist the idea or the notion that bias exists where they are. Maybe it's out there with some bad actors, but not in here. And some work by Joan Williams at UC Hastings, she looked at a group of 500 architects and ask questions about their experiences with biases. So for example, for the exact same qualification, do you have to work harder to have people listen to your ideas? And she looked at the intersection of race and gender. And in many of the outcomes of the survey, you can see that we indeed have a very different experience at work. That this experience that you have to prove it over and over again isn't the same for everyone. That for example, Black women, Asian women have a very high incidence of having to prove it over and over again, and white men have a lower incident of it. So if you were to say to someone, from your lived experience, does bias exist? They might answer no, because for them, it's very inconsequential. And so it takes thinking about the entire workplace, all the people we've hired and all the people that we want to promote in our organizations. And from there, think about whether bias exists, right? Not just necessarily from our own experience. And in all honesty, we don't know what we didn't get. So for many of us, we might have experienced bias, but didn't realize that we didn't get an opportunity because we only have access or visibility to what we did get. So this idea of C bias, block bias started with the foundation of the fact that many of our biases are what we would say are implicit or unconscious, meaning we didn't realize that we wrote a much longer more detailed, helpful performance evaluation for a man and a vague, shorter, less helpful evaluation for a woman. We didn't know, we just did that. Our brain was working away in these categories. That's what came out. And we had no idea that we wrote very different reviews for people. And so the C bias part is the idea that you can give people likely suspects, likely ways that bias will affect how you do certain things. And then the responsible thing to do would be to find a way to stop those biases from affecting your decision. So a lot of the studies that look at reducing your cognitive biases have short-term effects. But I can block bias even if I have them by taking certain methodologies. Most methodologies slow down your brain. You know, there's the fast thinking and slow thinking tend to be less prone to those quick decisions when we activate the slow thinking brain. So many of the bias blocking techniques are to stop. Now, one of the ways, if you study, these resume studies or performance review studies, is it turns out it's almost as if different criteria was used, or the same criteria was used differently. So in one interview study, one of our students was looking at men and women applying for software engineering jobs. And while the criteria was coding, the women often had to face a second criteria, how well they communicate their coding to others. Men could just prove they could code. Women had to convince others of the decision making, right? So it's like a different criteria set was used for women than men. Well, that's often how bias happens unconsciously. We didn't realize we asked different criteria for different people. It just seemed like the right question to ask in the moment. So a bias blocking technique is to clarify criteria before you evaluate. We're only going to look at coding. And that is defined by completing the problem, not on how you describe it to me. And if you don't complete the problem, that the logic you took, those steps were actually really good steps. You just missed something, right? If we say that's the only way we're evaluating candidates, and someone says, "Oh, I didn't like the way she described it. It was very unclear and she asked too many questions," you could go back to the original criteria. Great point. We said the only 3 ways we're evaluating candidates were these. Did she code? Did she complete the task? Yes. Was it a good solution? Yes. Great. Did you understand where this solution went? Yes. Great. Let's bracket the other comment, because we didn't ask you to evaluate communication style for everyone. So let's not just evaluate it for a few candidates. If that's an important criteria, we need to go back and assess everyone's fairly and equitably. If not, let's bracket it and focus on what we said was important for this stage of the interview, which was coding. And so in that way, even if I am biased, I'm being asked to think about the criteria we agreed upon and not all my impressions about the stereotype of coders or software engineers and women and all of that. I'm being forced to stick to the original criteria. And in those ways, we can try to block the biases from influencing our decisions.
Thank you. That's a great example too. I wrote down so many things, and I just when I'm like reflecting on them, I think what you said kind of from the beginning, the research with the 500 architects and looking at the intersections of race and gender, which I think is extremely important when we do this work, is the intersectionality of it. And yeah, the prove it again. That's not it's a very familiar concept, like prove it again, prove it again, prove it again. And I think as you're talking, also about when folks interview and having like certain criteria for one and maybe a couple different criteria for another one, depending on who the person is. I was thinking about when people apply, when men and women like apply for jobs, right? Like men are most likely apply. I don't know if I'm getting this percentage right, but if they see like the duties and they're like, might be able to do like half of them, they go ahead and apply for it. They don't give it a second thought, right? And then for women, it's usually like, can I do like 100% of them? And I think that's, you know, I don't know how we can change that. But you know, I guess I'm just thinking back about just barriers from the very beginning. Like how can we shift the mindset, right? How can we shift that? And
But it's also the way we write job descriptions.
yes.
So if we
Yeah.
think about, women have been conditioned to apply, that prove it again. They did have the qualifications, they didn't get it anyway. So you absorb these biases. You're ready for a promotion and you don't get it, right? Because of bias. So then you do start to doubt whether your qualifications are okay. So there are, again, ways to fix the process. So in job descriptions, you can say, this is, we're looking for this. And importantly, we're looking for people who have a learning orientation, who are curious and can help our team as a collective identify barriers that we're not seeing. We're interested in people's abilities to not only notice what everyone else is thinking about, but what we're missing. And so if you shift the job description to include really important skills, but aren't necessarily the ones that you check 5 years experience or BA or BS, then you're kind of expanding the person's ability to see themselves in it. And then importantly, even showing examples of that in case studies or little interview quotes of people who perhaps didn't have 10 years of accounting experience, but were really curious about the intersection of accounting and kind of global studies, which they did, and were able to maybe manage global teams of accountants because they understood cultural differences. So the perhaps, quote, deficit in years was actually not as important as that person's ability to work across global teams. And so what we say is we tend to overvalue certain kinds of qualifications and undervalue other kinds of qualifications that are just as important. In general, we tend to undervalue the relational traits, like contributing to team performance or recognizing gaps in relationships that need to be filled. We just assume people can do that, but we must have 10 years of accounting experience, right? So there are ways we can change the context for which people are experiencing bias and hopefully not only help them see themselves in our workplaces, but signal that we're a different kind of place where you can come and grow and contribute, not just prove it over and over again.
I love that. No, thank you for that. I know that when you look at a job description, there's oftentimes companies like required qualifications and desired qualifications. And again, just kind of shifting, like, are these really required? Like, do people have the ability to learn and be, and also like what you said, like that kind of clause, like we are looking for people who have, who can do da 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 da. And I think even more recently, companies have added, we encourage you to apply even if you do not have all of the qualifications. Yes. That's also out there. So that's a great point. Thank you. All right. So in your research and work, you foster a small wins approach. Some examples of small wins are giving credit where credit is due, identify and acknowledge where ideas originate. That's a big one. Don't be distracted by who speaks loudest or last. Become a mentor for high-performing women or help her find one who's a good fit. Mentors, both women and men, play a key role in encouraging and empowering women to advance in their careers. That's huge. And another small win is to commit to recruiting and considering at least 3 qualified candidates for your next job opening who would diversify your team in some substantial way. So I have a couple questions. This is 2 parts. So how do small wins coincide with solutions in closing the gender pay gap and improving the work environment for all employees? And I would love to hear if you have specific examples of when companies you've worked with have reported that a small wins approach has worked for them in advancing equity in their workplace.
Thank you. When people come to me and say, we really want to create, let's say, more equitable workplaces, one question I might ask them is, well, what is your theory of change? Because what you're really saying is there's a starting point, which is where we are today, and a direction we'd like to be moving towards with a future outcome. How do you see change happening in your organization? And there are many ways to approach a more equitable workplace. What we've studied in ours and have written about at our lab is the small wins approach to change. And it nests in a few good ideas, I think. What is that change is really hard. And if you don't identify a target area of change and really build momentum around it and figure out what works and doesn't work, you could take on a very large initiative and not understand what part of it worked and what part didn't. So by focusing on a very specific target, you might get better information and you might have a better chance of succeeding. Start small, succeed there, scale that momentum, then taking on everything at once and possibly having people could have throw away the initiative with the 1 or 2 things that didn't work. So a small wins approach to change, the way we define it is 1, you start with education. As we know, this isn't taught in most high schools or universities. We pretty much discover biases through our lived experience or by signing up for additional classes like this. So we often say education is not the end point, it's the starting point to have common frameworks for addressing the issue. Then, based on your target area of change, we diagnose the barriers. Like one company said, we want to have more women advancing to the director level. And we said, well, what do you think's holding them back? We think it's the performance review system. We said, great, that's where you should diagnose how women are being disadvantaged, possibly being disadvantaged, right? So you figure out based on your target area to find out what's not working. Then you would present the data to the managers and say, well, it turns out that, let's say, women are getting very different kinds of reviews than men are. What would you do to solve this problem? They're like, oh, we would try to standardize that everyone gets the exact same buckets of information in their reviews. It's not just an open box where we can free flow right in it, right? And then you'd study year over year whether indeed that change produced more similar performance reviews. But then the lagging indicator is if the processes are working, you would start to see more women making it through. And if not, you diagnose the next issue. Well, if it's not that, then maybe it's the way calibration meetings are being run or talent reviews. And you'd keep working on each target area of change until you saw movement. And all of our research sites are under a confidentiality agreement. And the one company that waived its confidentiality agreement is GoDaddy. They were so excited about the work we did that they started talking about it publicly. And so we asked them, well, we need permission to also be able to talk about it publicly. So there's a case study written at the Stanford Business School about our work with GoDaddy. It's been written up in the New York Times. And it's a good example to use because I can kind of talk about more specifics, but GoDaddy had a very poor reputation built based on its Super Bowl ads. And so when the new CEO took over and wanted to IPO, he wanted to really create the kind of organization that was sustainable and would fit into the community. And you can imagine it's not the sexiest business, right? They do web hosting. So they needed to figure out how to capitalize on the fact that they had over 90% name recognition for not a very distinguished product, but they earned it in a way that didn't resonate with where they wanted to go in the future. And their first idea was like, let's blow it all up and start from scratch. And what we know in general is that when we're in complete uncertainty, we tend to go back and try to pull from the past the things that worked before. So in general, that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of greater equity. And so what we did with GoDaddy is we talked about their performance system. We helped redefine success. So the very way you define success can give that advantage or disadvantage. So one area is often around innovation. When we think of innovation, if you think about it as an innate trait, like we need a brilliant genius, then it means that all the conditions of innovation are ignored. So one suggestion was to define innovation as a collaborative process and reward people for fostering a collaborative process. And that doesn't necessarily make us think of the stereotype of the lone genius, right? So we redefined success, created stronger processes, had people really think about why these processes were important. And GoDaddy did run their gender pay gap. After doing these processes, there was not one, and later reported they ran their racial pay gap and also didn't see a gap too. So thinking about equitable processes as one lever that helps companies achieve, reduction of the pay gap is very promising based on the work that we did with GoDaddy. And I think the article in the New York Times, it's fairly old. It was, if GoDaddy can turn the corner on sexism, who can't, right? So I always like to think of that, if they could do it, I think it's doable.
Thank you for that. And thank you for that, the example. I'll have to, so because I don't watch the Super Bowl and their ads, like are you saying that they kind of realized after what happened with their ads, like that made them kind of like have that moment like, oh, we need to change? Like, what was that?
A change in leadership, moving from like a kind of a founder grown company to one that was going to be publicly, invested in. The new CEO did not want to maintain this reputation. That was not a growth strategy for a publicly traded company. And so it was really a change in leadership. Even a change in leadership does not necessarily mean change will happen. And this person was really thoughtful. He grew up with a sister who studied gender topics, worked at a large company that had invested in processes for equity. And so his upbringing, his knowledge base, his kind of work experience pointed to him thinking change was possible and committed to investing in change happening. And so, without leadership support, change is very, very challenging. But you also need a really great change agent, the person who's going to get it done. Yeah. And so without those two, change is very challenging. A sustainable change. You can have short-term or isolated change, but to change an organization, leadership support and a really insightful change agent are two key ingredients.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Change management is not easy. And like you said, creating that sustainable change. And as you were talking, and thank you for sharing that case study, as you were talking, what comes to my mind, and I'm just speaking for myself, but knowing who's on the call today, it's like when you're committing to this, to equal pay and changing policies and practices and programs around equity in the workplace, it's literally it's a commitment, and it takes a lot of time and thought, and like you said, support from the very top, and somebody to and like you said, the change agent to do the work. So it is a commitment, and so just kind of like know what you're signing up for, and be in for a ride, whether it's bumpy or smooth. But with change, things, there are bumps in the road, and that's okay. So I'm going to pause for a minute to see if there are any questions in the chat. Okay. It looks like Anna has a question. Yeah, you can go ahead and come off mute, Anna.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm a huge fan of Laurie Mackenzie. She's amazing. She's actually presented to Stanford Healthcare before, and of course, part of the Stanford family. So my question is really around some thoughts around the greater wage gaps between women of color. So we see the wage gaps, whether you identify as Hispanic, Black. So just thoughts on that to Laurie.
Thank you, Anna. And I recently read a study by Ascend that disaggregated kind of men and women and looked at the pay gap within the AAPI community and discovered that East Asian and Southeast Asian women were exactly with Latina and Black women in the pay gap. So even within the AAPI community, which overall has the lowest racialized pay gap, East Asian and Southeast Asian women were right there with Latinas and Black women. And so given the there are overall ways to think about it, and yet there also can be many insights gleaned by doing a deeper dive, even as I said, between East Asian, Southeast Asian, Latinas, ones that are maybe under certain conditions or not under certain conditions. One of the ways to think about it for me is that what are the resistance to their advancement in the organization? So while for Latinas and Blacks, hiring may be the biggest issue. They're not being hired into our organization. Asians tend to be hired, at least in California context, into the organizations. What we all share is a lack of promotion within the organization. And that even starts with, as we've seen from the Lean In Mackenzie study, it starts with the very first promotion to manager. So if I were thinking about the pay gap for women of color, I might start thinking about those very early assignments in the company. So it turns out women often get the least experienced and least networked managers. So women might be underrepresented, women of color underrepresented. So we already start with a deficit in our network connections. Then, and maybe because of our backgrounds, my parents were not professional in the way that I meet many professionals today. They didn't tell me a lot of the inside rules of work. So I discovered them by erring about those rules of work or having misconceptions about them. So you walk in with perhaps fewer network connections, less awareness about these unwritten rules of work, and then I'm assigned to the least experienced and least networked manager, which compounds my ability to get things done. We also know that in many times these cross-functional teams, well, my manager might support me. I need to get work done by this cross-functional team whose managers might not be aware of gender equity issues, and they themselves might not be aware of it. So while my team might be supporting me, I'm now on my own trying to convince these other people to listen to me, right? So that network connection and influence would have really helped me. So one is the first assignment, making sure the manager is experienced. Two, I might think about the kinds of work that we give to women of color. One woman, one professor I talked to said he was concerned for the first Black postdoc he had in his lab and was trying to give her something very doable so she felt like she could achieve. And what she said to him was, accidentally, what you did was you signaled to others that I'm not technically competent by giving me the easy assignment, right? So give a meaningful assignment, but also with the support to succeed. Because if those cross-functional teams won't respond to me, that could be my demise, not my capacity, right? And then when we think about mentoring and sponsorship, we tend to want to mentor and sponsor people who are like us. And if leaders are less diverse than at entry level, then we could think about breaking down those barriers, right? So it's a complex question. What do we have in common as women of color? We deal with more microaggressions, more office housework that we're doing. But I think what we really want is to advance in our organization. Research shows that we're just as ambitious as everyone else. So supporting us once we're in an organization to advance, recognizing that there can be barriers, that's something I'm very optimistic about.
Thank you, Lori. It's always learning from you.
Thank you for that question, Anna. Great question. And yes, thank you, Lori. That's great. I think definitely I took away a few nuggets. Like the meaningful assignments is that's facts right there. Like I think it's really important to as managers to do that to help support people to succeed. I did see another question in the chat. The question is from Susan, and she says, have you done any research on the pay gap in trans women? Thank you for that question, Susan.
Yes, thank you, Susan. I haven't personally done that pay gap analysis, but I will confirm that biases are indeed strong amongst people from the LGBTQ plus community. And some of it, as you can imagine, is the demand to kind of decide how out you are in a workplace. And without a supportive, stable work environment, you could imagine that kind of concern in the workplace takes cognitive and emotional energy that you would otherwise be applying to your job. There's some really great work by Erin Seck, who's at the University of Michigan, and she studied LGBTQ plus employees at 2 NASA sites. And one was in Florida, and I think one was in California. They allowed her again to cite the company and the locations. And you would think that the Florida site would have been one where you had kind of more cognitive and emotional work, but it wasn't so. And one of the conclusions Erin came to was that it was the stability of the teams. So they didn't switch teams all the time. We didn't work on one project with this team and one project with that team and switch it up all the time. And because the teams were more stable, that sense of belonging was stronger for people in the LGBTQ plus community. And so I think about pay gaps as reducing barriers and inclusion taxes that people have to pay, in addition to kind of looking at the people processes and the kind of the pay that people get. And the taxes can be quite high, the level of harassment for people from the trans community. So one of the ways I might think about too is like reducing those taxes that they have to pay that consume their cognitive and emotional energy. And that means it's harder for them to get the same amount of work done in the workplace. And that can be a big contributor to belonging and feeling like they can be productive and really engaged with their teams.
And what was her last name? Her first name was Anne.
Erin Seck. I can write it right into Erin Seck, and she's at University of Michigan. And she did work on LGBT. We're going to write a little piece about it for Pride Month. We have someone working on that to summarize that research, because it's an academic paper, and sometimes not everyone has access to academic journals. And so we're going to summarize that at the lab.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, and looking forward to that summary as well. And we will put, I'll put a link in. It is, I think, June 13th is LGBTQ Awareness Day, Equal Pay Day. And so I'll put a link in the chat so folks can check that out as well. I'm going to check the chat again. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anybody have any other questions? Please feel free to put one in the chat or come off mute. Yes, and Morgan is putting just a couple different resources in for folks. California Equal Pay Playbook. Oh, we do have one more question. Are there trainings for HR professionals on compensation?
Absolutely. I don't offer any or am not connected to any. There are a lot of resources on, first of all, how do you calculate the pay gap, right? And I know the California Partner Project has some really great resources there. I'm not sure if they also have resources on trainings that you can take. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer to that, but absolutely they are. And what I might look for if I was looking for a training was, one step would be how to calculate it, but then to diagnose how my organization could think about reducing that gap, and diagnosing the particular flavor you think would be most promising for you to address. That's something that I would probably look for if I was looking for a particular training, is how do they help you diagnose how the pay gap is manifesting itself, and come up with some strategies to start to do these small wins and reduce the pay gap over time.
Thank you for that, Lori. And we do, on the commission's website as well, we do have resources for that. So when we send out the recording, or we post the recording in the, because it'll be on YouTube, so I'll put some resources along with the See Bias, Block Bias resource in that, so folks will have that as well. Because that's what we want to do. We want, you know, you to have the resources to be able to do the work, and start small. Like Lori said, start small if it seems very overwhelming, because it can be, but one step is a step in the right direction. So, all right, well, I don't see any more questions in the chat, and we're almost at time. I just want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I really, really appreciate, Lori, I appreciate you and your team and all the work that you do in this space, and really want to take the time to thank you for sharing space with us today, and helping us understand the hidden accelerators of the gender pay gap, because there are many, and really give credit to this work that will help move the needle for us. So we really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And, it's one of those things where it does take a village. We all have to be working on our piece for it. So thank you, Kimberlee, and the Commission for the Status of Women for doing this work and bringing visibility to a very important topic. Women are 40% of primary or sole breadwinners in the country. And so pay gap means that families aren't getting what they need to thrive. So it's really a critical issue, and I'm glad you're tackling it, or we're tackling it together.
Yes. Yeah, you're welcome, and thank you. And thank you everyone for joining, and hope everyone has a great afternoon and stay cool. I know it's almost 100 degrees where I am, and so I'm sure if you're in California, which many of you are, just stay cool and stay safe, and have a good one. Thanks for joining.
Thank you for all the good work, Kimberlee, and everyone, and great. Thank you, Lori.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome,
so much.
Tracy.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for joining.
Bye-bye.
Bye.